The gunshot cracked through the ballroom like a bone snapping in half. Every chandelier trembled. Every woman in an evening gown dropped her champagne glass. Every man in a tuxedo pressed himself against the nearest wall, and not one of them moved to help. Not one of them except the quiet man in the corner. He was already moving before the second shot came, before the screaming started, before the lights flickered and died, before Victoria Caldwell's daughter pressed herself into the darkness beneath a catering table and shut her eyes so tight she couldn't see anything at all. The quiet man moved like he'd done this before, because he had. If this kind of story reaches something deep inside you, the kind that stays with you long after it ends, then you're exactly the person this channel was made for. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. Tap the like button if you believe second chances are real. And drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. This one is worth staying for. The security system at the Caldwell mansion had been installed by the best firm in the city, with motion sensors on every exterior door, cameras covering every blind spot, and a private response team on call around the clock. On paper, it was nearly impenetrable. Ethan Walker had spotted 11 vulnerabilities in the first 20 minutes after arriving. He hadn't said anything about it. That wasn't his job tonight. His job was to stand near the service entrance, keep his earpiece in, and make sure none of the catering staff wandered into restricted areas of the building. Simple work. Invisible work. The kind of work that let a man disappear into the background of someone else's important evening and go home afterward without being remembered. That was exactly how he preferred it. He was 37 years old, and he had gotten very good at not being remembered. Ethan stood near the east corridor with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching the guests drift between the main ballroom and the terrace garden beyond the glass doors. The charity event had drawn close to 300 people, old money, new money, philanthropists who wrote checks as a way of feeling better about the money they made in industries they'd rather not discuss. They wore expensive clothes and talked loudly over the string quartet, and Ethan watched them the way he watched most things, calmly, comprehensively, and from a distance. He wasn't there to judge them. He was simply paying attention, because paying attention was the one habit he'd never been able to turn off. Not in the 12 years since he left the Navy. Not even on the quiet Sunday mornings when he sat at the kitchen table watching his daughter eat cereal and tell him about her dreams. Mia had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she was 6 years old, and she was the only reason any of this mattered. He shifted his weight slightly, repositioned himself to improve his sightline toward the main entrance, and went back to watching the room. Victoria Caldwell was easy to find. She was always easy to find. Not because she tried to be, but because the room arranged itself around her without anyone consciously deciding that it should. She stood near the center of the ballroom in a deep burgundy dress that looked understated compared to what most of the women around her were wearing, which was exactly the point. She held a glass of sparkling water in one hand, and when she laughed at something the man beside her said, it reached her eyes about halfway and stopped there. Ethan noticed that. He noticed most things. Victoria Caldwell was 30 years old, and she ran a technology company worth somewhere north of $12 billion. And she had done it largely alone after her husband, Daniel, disappeared 3 years earlier under circumstances the press had described as a tragic accident and the police had closed as inconclusive. She had one daughter, Lily, age 7, who was currently somewhere upstairs in the mansion with a nanny because Victoria didn't bring her to these events if she could help it. This was all information Ethan had because it was his job to have it, background on the principal. Nothing personal. He looked away from her and checked the east corridor again. The evening was supposed to be simple. The first thing that went wrong was the fire alarm. Not a real fire, Ethan knew that immediately, because the smell was wrong. There was no smoke, no spike in temperature, nothing that would explain why the alarm panel near the kitchen suddenly lit up and started screaming. Someone had triggered it manually, which meant someone was using it as cover for something else. He was already moving toward the main ballroom when the lights went out. Not a power failure. The emergency generators kicked in within 4 seconds, exactly as they should have, but the main chandelier system stayed dark. Someone had cut a specific circuit. That level of specificity meant planning. That level of planning meant this was not opportunistic. The ballroom descended into confusion. 300 people in formal wear, suddenly in near darkness, with an alarm screaming overhead and the string quartet abandoning their instruments. People shouted. Someone knocked over a drinks table. The sound of breaking glass skittered across the marble floor. Ethan moved through it without difficulty. He'd trained in worse conditions than this. In actual darkness, in actual danger, with actual bullets traveling in actual directions that were not good for his health. A panicked charity event was disorienting to people who had never been trained to orient themselves. For Ethan, it was simply loud. He reached the ballroom entrance and took in the situation in about 2 seconds. 3 men in black tactical clothing were moving through the near dark toward the server room corridor on the opposite side of the building. Not toward the guests, not toward the art collection or the jewelry, toward the server room. Data. They were here for data. 2 of Victoria's contracted security guards had positioned themselves near the main doors, which was the wrong position. They were protecting an exit when the threat was already inside. The 3rd guard was visible near the terrace doors, and he had his hand on his radio and looked like a man who was very sincerely hoping that someone else would handle this. Ethan pressed his earpiece. Jacobson, 3 Tangos, East Wing, heading toward the server corridor. I need you on the south stairwell, now. Static. Either Jacobson's radio was down or he was somewhere he couldn't respond. Ethan exhaled once, slowly, and accepted that he was handling this alone. He was good at that too. He caught the first one in the corridor before the man even knew he was there. It was quick, and it was quiet, and the man went down without firing his weapon, which was the important part. Ethan zip-tied his wrist to a support pipe, took the man's radio, and listened to the chatter for 4 seconds before he understood the broader picture. There were 5 of them, not 3. 2 had already reached the server room. The other 2 were upstairs. Upstairs, where Lily Caldwell was with her nanny. Ethan changed direction without hesitation. The main staircase was too visible, so he used the servants' stairs at the north end of the corridor, taking the steps 2 at a time in near silence. At the top of the stairs, he paused just long enough to hear voices. 1 panicked female voice, 1 clipped and professional male voice giving instructions. The nanny. And one of them. He came through the door of the upstairs sitting room fast enough that the man inside didn't have time to properly react. There was a brief and ugly few seconds that Ethan would rather not replay in detail. And then the man was on the floor, and the nanny was pressed against the wall with her hands shaking, and Lily Caldwell was crouched in the corner behind a large chair with her knees pulled to her chest. Ethan looked at the little girl, 7 years old, dark hair like her mother, eyes that were big and terrified, but not, and this struck him, not completely surprised, like she had been frightened before and knew what it felt like, and had already started working on holding it together. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "You're okay. I work security. No one's coming up those stairs while I'm standing between them and you." Lily stared at him. "Are you scared?" he asked. A pause. Then quietly, "Yes." "That's smart. Being scared means your brain is paying attention." He glanced at the nanny. "Can you take her to the bathroom? Interior room, no windows, and lock the door? Don't open it for anyone until I come back and knock 3 times. The nanny nodded, found enough of herself to stand up straight, and took Lily's hand. Lily went with her, but at the doorway she stopped and looked back at Ethan. "There's a song," she said. He didn't understand that, and he didn't have time to ask about it. "Go." She went. He cleared the remaining 2 in the server room with enough efficiency that neither of them got what they came for. By the time Victoria's actual contracted security team had gathered their collective nerve and called for backup, Ethan had secured all 5 individuals, retrieved the data drives that had already been removed from the servers, and returned to the east corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression neutral when the backup team arrived. They looked at him. They looked at the 5 men zip-tied to various pieces of architectural infrastructure. They looked at the retrieved drives. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "Subcontractor. East entrance detail." He handed over the drives and the confiscated radio. "You'll want to review your perimeter protocol. 3rd camera on the south exterior wall was looped at 9:47. That's how they came in." He did not wait for a response. He found a quiet corner near the catering station, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and stood there drinking it while the ballroom slowly reassembled itself into something resembling order. The lights came back on. Someone restarted the music too brightly and too cheerfully for the mood, then turned it off again. Victoria Caldwell appeared from somewhere near the back of the room, talking rapidly into her phone, flanked by two men in suits who were clearly trying to tell her something she was clearly not ready to hear yet. She scanned the room. Her eyes stopped on Ethan. He looked back at her steadily. She excused herself from the two men, handed her phone to one of them, and walked across the room toward him with the kind of focused deliberateness that told him she was still running on adrenaline and was about 30 minutes from crashing hard. "You," she said. "Yes. You're the one who—" She stopped, recalibrated. "My security team is telling me that 5 men are secured in my east wing and my servers are intact." "That's accurate." "They're also telling me that someone named Walker apparently handled all of it before anyone else even understood what was happening." Ethan said nothing. Victoria looked at him the way she probably looked at balance sheets and structural inconsistencies, like something didn't add up and she was not going to stop until it did. "You're subcontracted to Meridian Security." "Yes." "Who hired you specifically?" "General staffing for the event." "I don't have a name for you." "That's—" She exhaled. "Fine, we'll sort that out. My daughter, she's upstairs, she's fine. The nanny has her in the interior bathroom on the 2nd floor." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper with the nanny's cell number, which he'd gotten in the 30 seconds before leaving the room. He held it out. "She'll want to hear your voice." Victoria took the paper. Something in her face shifted slightly. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complicated than gratitude. Like she'd been handed something she wasn't sure how to hold. She dialed. Waited. Then softly, in a voice that was nothing like the voice she'd been using. "Lily, it's Mom. I'm coming up." She handed the phone back to the aide who had appeared at her elbow, and then she looked at Ethan again. "Thank you," she said, flat, straightforward, not performing it. "Don't mention it." "I'm going to mention it quite a bit, actually. I'd like to talk to you tomorrow. Properly. If you're available." Ethan considered this. He had a report to file, a daughter to pick up from his neighbors by 8 in the morning, and a very strong preference for returning to being invisible. "I'll be available," he said, because something told him that saying no to Victoria Caldwell required more energy than he currently had. She nodded and turned to go. That was when Lily came running. She had apparently convinced the nanny that the 3-knock system no longer applied, because she came flying down the main staircase in her pajamas, bypassed her mother entirely, ran straight across the ballroom floor, and grabbed Ethan's hand with both of hers, the way children grab things they're afraid of losing. He looked down at her, startled, genuinely startled, which didn't happen to him often. "Hey," he said, "you're supposed to be upstairs." "I know." She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at something internal, something she was trying to find words for. "The song you were humming." He went very still. "In the hallway," Lily said. "When you were standing outside the door, you were humming. I heard you through the door." Ethan tried to remember. He did sometimes hum without realizing it, an old reflex, something to keep the mind from spinning too fast in the quiet. He hadn't thought about what he was humming. "Mommy." Lily turned to look at Victoria, and her voice had gone very small. "He knows the song Daddy used to sing before he disappeared." The ballroom, which had been buzzing with recovery and nervous conversation, seemed to recede. Victoria stared at her daughter. Then she stared at Ethan. He kept his face as still as he could, because his face had gotten very good at being still over many years of practice. But something was happening behind it that he hadn't expected, something he didn't have a name for yet. A cold, precise recognition, like a key turning in a lock he'd believed was sealed shut for good. The song wasn't a song he'd learned in the Navy. It was older than that. It was something he'd heard once, years ago, in circumstances he had never told anyone about, and had spent a very long time trying not to think about. "What is your name?" Victoria asked him, quietly, differently than before. "Ethan Walker." She looked at him for a long time, and he could see her trying to put together a puzzle whose pieces she didn't fully have yet. He knew the feeling. "Tomorrow," she said finally. It wasn't a question anymore. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Lily was still holding his hand. He gently uncurled her fingers, one by one, and handed her carefully back to her mother. Then he picked up his coffee, finished it, set the cup down on the nearest surface, and walked toward the service exit with steady, unhurried steps, the way a man walks when he needs very badly to be somewhere quiet and alone, and he's been in enough bad situations to know how not to run. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled like cut grass and car exhaust. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets. He hadn't hummed that song in 11 years. He had believed, until approximately 20 minutes ago, that no one alive would recognize it. He'd been wrong. He drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The streets were mostly empty at that hour, just traffic lights cycling through their colors for nobody, the occasional cab cutting a yellow line through the wet asphalt. Ethan moved through it mechanically, taking the turns he always took, stopping where he always stopped, and not thinking about the song. He was trying very hard not to think about the song. His neighbor, Mrs. Patrice, was already in her robe when he knocked. She was 64 years old and had the build of a woman who had raised 4 sons without much help from anyone, and she had been watching Mia on his late nights for almost 2 years without ever once asking him why a security consultant needed to work past midnight. "She's asleep," Patrice said, stepping aside to let him in. "Ate most of her dinner, fought me on the bath, but eventually cooperated." "That's a win," Ethan said. "She asked about you." "She always does." "She asked if you were going to be okay." He paused at that. Mia was 6. She asked questions like that, with a directness that skipped over the polite middle ground and landed somewhere uncomfortable, and he never entirely knew what to do with them. What did you tell her?" Patrice looked at him steadily. "I told her yes." "Thank you." "Was I right?" He considered this for a moment longer than he should have. "Probably." She let that sit without pushing it, which was one of the things he genuinely appreciated about her. He carried Mia home over his shoulder. The girl didn't wake, just made a small sound and pressed her face into his neck the way she had since she was an infant. And he got her into bed and stood in her doorway for a while in the dark, listening to her breathe. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay on top of the covers with his boots off and his eyes on the ceiling, and he thought, carefully and without panic, about the song, about where he'd first heard it, about what that meant, if anything, about whether it was possible that what Lily said was just the misremembering of a grieving child who badly wanted the world to make sense, and whether that explanation actually held up under scrutiny. It didn't. He knew which song he'd been humming. He'd known it the moment Lily said the words through the bathroom door, and the knowing had landed in his chest like something cold and very heavy. He hadn't thought about Daniel Caldwell in a long time. He thought about him now. By 5 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and made coffee. The Caldwell corporate headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower downtown, and Victoria's private office sat at the corner of the 43rd floor with windows on 2 sides that gave her a view of the city that was probably meant to feel powerful and mostly just felt exposed. She'd always thought that the view was more about being seen than about seeing, but she'd kept the office because changing it felt like the kind of weakness she couldn't afford. Ethan arrived at 9. He'd dropped Mia at school, gone home, changed out of the previous night's clothes, and made himself look like a person who had slept. He wore dark jeans and a plain gray shirt, and he carried nothing, which her assistant noted with a small frown when she met him at the elevator. "Ms. Caldwell is expecting you," the assistant said. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine." He wasn't fine, but that was not relevant. Victoria was standing at the window when he came in, her back to the door, a phone pressed to her ear. She held up one finger without turning around, "Give me a minute," and continued her conversation, which appeared to be with a lawyer and appeared to be about liability and NDA structuring, and which Ethan did not particularly try to follow. He sat in one of the chairs across from her desk and waited. The office was less staged than he'd expected. There were files stacked on the credenza that hadn't been put away, and a child's drawing tacked to the wall near the window. Crayon, lopsided house, 2 figures of unequal height holding hands. Lily's work, almost certainly. The contrast between the 43rd floor view and the crayon drawing was so stark it was almost funny, and it told him more about Victoria Caldwell than any profile he could have pulled. She hung up and turned around. She looked like she hadn't slept either, and unlike Ethan, she hadn't been able to fully conceal it. There were shadows under her eyes, and a tightness around her jaw that came from holding a particular expression for too many hours in a row. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling into her chair. No preamble. You didn't give me much room to decline. No, she agreed without apology. I didn't. She opened a folder on her desk and then closed it again, like she'd decided to approach this differently than planned. I had my team run a background check on you last night. Standard procedure. I do it for everyone who works in or near my building. What did you find? Almost nothing. She said it flatly, like it was an accusation. Ethan Walker, age 37, born in Raleigh, North Carolina, single father. Daughter, Mia, age 6. You've held 4 different positions in the private security sector over the last 9 years. Before that, there's a gap. 7 years that your record accounts for with very general language about military service. Ethan said nothing. The people who do your kind of work, the men who move through a room the way you moved through mine last night, they don't usually end up doing subcontract work at charity events. People end up all kinds of places. Don't do that, she said. Not sharply. Almost tiredly. Don't give me the vague deflection. I watched you handle 5 armed men last night with less visible stress than most people have parallel parking. Lily recognized something in you. I'd like to understand what. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, What exactly did Lily tell you about the song? Victoria's expression shifted, something tightening, something careful coming over her features. She said she heard you humming in the hallway. She said it was the song Daniel used to sing to her when she was small, when she couldn't sleep. A pause. She was very certain. How old was she when your husband disappeared? 4. Victoria's hands were flat on the desk. She remembers very little about him. His face, she says, has become unclear. But she remembers the song. I don't know why certain things stay and others don't. Ethan understood that. He understood it more than he wanted to. What was Daniel's background, he asked, before you married him? Her eyes narrowed slightly. He was in international business development, import and logistics. That's what he told you. The silence that followed was very loud. What are you saying? Her voice had dropped. Ethan measured his next words carefully, the way he measured everything. I'm not saying anything yet. I'm asking what you actually knew about what your husband did before and during your marriage. I knew... She stopped, started again. I knew what he told me, which was that he managed international accounts for a trade consulting firm, that he traveled frequently, that there were aspects of his work he wasn't able to discuss in detail. She said the last part with something that wasn't quite bitterness, but lived in the same neighborhood. At the time, I told myself it was confidentiality, corporate sensitivity. And after he disappeared? After he disappeared, the police told me his firm had no record of several of the trips he'd claimed to take. She stood up, walked to the window, not for the view, but because she needed to move. I spent about 8 months trying to figure out what that meant. Then I stopped, because I had a company to run and a 4-year-old daughter who kept asking where her father was, and I couldn't keep doing both. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer is that you don't know. She turned from the window. Go ahead. Did Daniel ever mention an operation called Linchpin? Something crossed her face. Not recognition, exactly, but the ghost of something half-remembered. No, not by name. Did he have any contact with military personnel? Special operations, intelligence contractors, anything like that? Not that I... She stopped again. Her eyes went somewhere else for a moment. There was a man, once, about 4 months before Daniel disappeared. He came to the house, not to the front door, he came to the back. I saw them through the kitchen window. They talked for maybe 10 minutes. Daniel told me afterward it was an old colleague. What did the man look like? I barely saw him. It was evening. He was medium height, dark jacket. She paused. He had a scar along his left jaw. I noticed it when he turned to leave. Ethan said nothing. The scar along his left jaw was from a training accident in Coronado, 2009. He'd never bothered to have it properly treated. Walker, Victoria said. Her voice was very controlled now, in a way that told him she was working hard to keep it that way. Was that you? It wasn't a question. She was already 90% certain, and she was waiting for him to close the remaining distance. He held her gaze. Yes. She sat back down in her chair heavily, not elegantly, just sat down, like her legs had made an executive decision on her behalf. You knew my husband. I knew him. How? That's a longer answer. I have time. Her voice was tight. I have a great deal of time for this particular answer. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. This was the part he had spent the night deciding how to approach, and he still wasn't sure he'd made the right call. There were things he couldn't tell her, not because he didn't want to, but because some of those things would put her in danger that she wasn't currently in. But there was enough of the truth that he could give her something real. Your husband, he said, was not lying to you about everything. He did have a business. The business was real. But for a period of approximately 3 years before you met him, he worked in an adjacent capacity to a special operations program. Not officially. He wasn't military. But he had contacts, access, and a skill set that made him useful in certain situations. What kind of situations? The kind that don't appear in any official record. She stared at him. And you were part of this program. I was part of a unit that occasionally interfaced with it. He paused. The night I came to your house, to the back of your house, I wasn't there to see Daniel socially. I was there to warn him. There was movement in a network that we'd been monitoring for a long time, and his name had surfaced in a way that made people uncomfortable. What kind of movement? An organization that specialized in acquiring sensitive intelligence and selling it to whoever paid the most. Daniel had information they wanted, not because he'd stolen it, because he'd been present for certain things, and presence is its own kind of liability. Victoria was very still. Did they take him? I don't know. He said it directly without softening it. I warned him. He said he understood. 4 months later, he was gone, and by then I was in a different part of the world, dealing with a different situation, and I didn't find out what happened until much later. But you have a theory. I have several. And you're not going to share them. Not yet. Not until I understand why those 5 men were in your building last night. Because I don't think it was a coincidence, and I don't think it was random. And if I'm right about what's connecting these things, then there are conversations we need to have very carefully and in a very specific order. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Her expression was hard to read, which he suspected was usually by design, and was currently the result of her genuinely not knowing how to arrange her face around what she was feeling. You've known who I was, she said slowly, when you took the contract for last night. You knew. I recognized the name when the staffing assignment came through. And you took the job anyway. Yes. Why? He thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated, and he wasn't entirely sure he understood all of it himself. Because if that organization was still active and was circling around you, I wanted to know. And because... He stopped. Because what? Because I owed your husband a debt I was never able to pay. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the city made its ordinary sounds. Traffic, wind, the distant mechanical complaint of a delivery truck, indifferent to everything happening on the 43rd floor. Lily recognized the song, Victoria said finally. Yes. The song you were humming in my hallway. Yes. Why do you know it? He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. Daniel sang it the night I was at your house. After I left, I was walking to my car, and the kitchen window was open and he'd gone back inside, and I heard it. He was singing it, I assumed, to Lily. She must have been upstairs. He paused. It's not a well-known song. It's not something you'd hear on the radio. I don't know where he learned it. His mother, Victoria said quietly. She was from a small town in Eastern Europe. It was something from her childhood. He never told me what the words meant. He just sang the melody. Ethan nodded once. The melody. That was what he'd been humming, without realizing, in the upstairs corridor of the mansion while he stood guard outside the bathroom door. Just the melody. Just a sound his brain had pulled up from somewhere without asking his permission. She remembered, Victoria said. She's sharp, Ethan said. Even at 7. She was frightened last night, but she held herself together better than most adults would have. Something softened briefly in Victoria's face, just briefly. She's stubborn, like her father. Then the softness closed again. What do you need from me? To figure out what's actually happening. Access. To your company's security infrastructure, your communications logs from the last 6 months, and any documentation related to contracts or partnerships in sectors that deal with government-adjacent work. That's a significant ask. It is. And if I say no, then I go back to subcontracting work and you hire better guards, and we both hope last night was a one-time event. She picked up a pen from her desk, turned it over once in her fingers, set it back down. A thinking gesture. You could have told me last night who you were. Why didn't you? Because a ballroom full of shaken people is not the right place for that conversation. And a 43rd floor office is? It's better, he said. You're behind a locked door. You've had a few hours. And your assistant already checked me for weapons when I came off the elevator, which tells me she's better trained than she looks. For the first time since he'd walked in, the corner of Victoria's mouth moved, just barely. Not quite a smile, sir. More like the acknowledgement that a smile existed somewhere in the vicinity. She's very good, Victoria said. I pay her accordingly. She stood again, and this time it was purposeful. A decision made. She walked to her credenza, unlocked the lower drawer with a key from her jacket pocket, and pulled out a thin drive. She set it on the desk between them. That's the master security log from the last 8 months. It was supposed to go to our external audit firm next week. She paused. I want to know what you find. He picked it up. I'll need a few days. You have 3. She paused. And Walker, I want to be clear about something. I'm not a woman who does well with half-truths. I understand there are things you can't tell me yet, and I accept that for now. But the window on my patience is not open-ended. Understood. Do you have a number? A real one. Not a company line. He pulled a card from his wallet, plain white, just a cell number, and set it on the desk. She looked at it. That's it? No name? You already know my name. She picked it up. I'll be in touch. He stood and was almost to the door when she said quietly, One more thing. He stopped. Lily asked me this morning if the man from last night was going to come back. Victoria's voice was even, professional, like she was reporting data. I told her I didn't know. She said, a small pause. She said she hoped you would, because you were the same as the feeling she remembers from when her father was home. Ethan had his hand on the door frame. He didn't turn around because he didn't particularly want her to see his face at that moment. I'll be in touch when I've gone through the log, he said. He left. He picked Mia up from school at 3:15, and she came running out the front gate with her backpack bouncing and a painting rolled up under one arm that had clearly suffered some structural damage during the day. What happened to the painting, he asked. Kevin sat on it. On purpose? He said no, but his face said yes. Ethan took the painting and unrolled it carefully. It was a blue horse standing in what appeared to be a field of orange, with a yellow sun that took up most of the sky. I like it. You have to say that. I actually like it. He rolled it back up. Do you want ice cream or do you have homework? Both. One then the other. Ice cream then homework, Mia said firmly. Noted. They walked to the small parlor 2 blocks from their apartment building, and Mia ordered strawberry, always strawberry, every time, as though she was afraid it would be discontinued if she didn't remain loyal, and she ate it with the focused intensity of a person conducting important work. Daddy, she said, not looking up from her cup. Yeah. You look tired. I'm fine. Mrs. Patrice said you were probably fine. She was right. Mia looked up at him then, with those eyes that he could not look at directly for too long because they reminded him too much of someone he had lost and couldn't get back. You did something scary last night, she said. It was not a question. He held her gaze. I helped some people who needed it. And that's the scary part? Sometimes, he said. Yeah. She considered this with the seriousness that children apply to things that adults try to make sound simple. Then she went back to her ice cream. Okay, she said, just okay. Like she'd filed it and moved on. He watched her eat and felt, as he sometimes did, the particular weight of trying to give a child a life that was ordinary and stable and full of small, reliable pleasures when the person doing the giving was neither ordinary nor particularly stable and had not been for a very long time. He was good at the routine of it, the school pickups, the dinners, the homework battles, the bedtime negotiations. He had built the routine carefully, deliberately, the way he'd once planned operations, account for every variable, reduce exposure, protect what mattered. But last night had cracked something open that he'd thought was sealed. And 3 blocks away, in a school very similar to Mia's, a 7-year-old girl had recognized a melody that she had no business remembering, and the world had shifted slightly on its axis in a way he didn't yet know how to account for. He drove home through the late afternoon traffic and thought about the drive he'd put in his jacket pocket, and thought about the name he hadn't said out loud in 11 years, and thought about the organization he'd believed, had allowed himself to believe, was finished. He thought about all of it in careful silence while Mia fell asleep in the back seat, her mouth slightly open, the damaged painting clutched to her chest. Back at the apartment, he got her into bed without waking her, then sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a second cup of coffee and plugged in the drive. The files loaded slowly. There were hundreds of them. Transaction logs, communications metadata, security incident reports filed across 8 months of corporate operations. Most of it would be irrelevant. That was the nature of this kind of work, a vast amount of noise, and somewhere inside the noise, a signal. He started from the oldest files and worked forward. By midnight, he had found 3 anomalies. By 1 in the morning, he had traced them back to a single point of origin, a routing address that bounced through 4 proxy servers before disappearing, but not before leaving a trace so small that whoever had planted it probably assumed it was invisible. They'd assumed wrong. He sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. The routing signature was not one he recognized from recent work, but it matched something he'd seen before. A particular pattern, a particular fingerprint, from files that were now locked in a server he no longer had clearance to access. He recognized it because he had spent 8 months, a decade ago, tracking that exact signature through a network that was supposed to have been dismantled when the operation that produced it was shut down. The operation was called Linchpin, and it had not, apparently, been as thoroughly shut down as anyone had believed. He closed the laptop, very carefully, and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then he took out the plain white card with Victoria's number on it, looked at it, and put it back in his pocket. He wasn't ready to make that call yet, but he was going to have to make it very soon. He called her at 7:30 the next morning, not because he was ready, exactly, but because ready was a luxury he'd stopped waiting for a long time ago. You moved when the situation required movement, not when you felt comfortable enough to do it. Comfort was not a factor he'd been able to include in his calculations for most of his adult life. Victoria picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake for a while. "Walker," she said, "I found something in the logs. I need to see you today. Not at your office." A brief pause. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I'd rather not have the conversation anywhere with a fixed security camera and a front desk attendant who logs all visitors." Another pause. Longer. "There's a coffee place on Meridian 2 blocks east of the park. Halston's. It's small, the back corner booth is usually empty, and the owner is 70 years old and doesn't care about anyone's business." 1 hour, he said. "I'll be there." He dropped Mia at school early, telling her teacher there was a work appointment, and drove to Meridian with the drive in his inside jacket pocket and 3 hours of sleep behind his eyes. The coffee place was exactly what Victoria had described, narrow and slightly worn around the edges, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and the particular smell of a place that had been making the same roast for 30 years and saw no reason to change it. Victoria was already in the back booth when he arrived. No assistant this time, no bodyguard, which worried him slightly. She had a coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched, and she was looking at her phone in the way people look at phones when they're not actually reading anything on them. He slid into the seat across from her. "You look worse than yesterday," she said. "Thank you." "I meant you look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." He ordered a black coffee from the young woman who materialized briefly at his elbow, then put the drive on the table between them. "I went through the full 8 months. Most of it is clean, but there are 3 anomalies in the communications metadata, routing patterns that don't match anything legitimate." Victoria looked at the drive. "Explain that in language that doesn't assume I have a background in network security." "Someone has been accessing your internal communications system, not breaking in. They already had access. A key, essentially. They've been pulling metadata. Not the content of communications, but the pattern. Who contacts whom, how often, about what general category of business. For how long? Based on the signature, at least 7 months. Possibly longer, but the log only goes back 8. She was quiet for a moment. Her coffee sat between her hands and she looked at it. "Who?" The routing signature matches a network I encountered during my time in a military special operations context, an organization called Linchpin. He watched her face carefully. I asked you about that name 2 days ago. You said it meant nothing to you. It still doesn't. Your husband's name appeared in Linchpin-related intelligence approximately 14 months before he disappeared, not because he was a member of the organization, because he had inadvertently become aware of certain aspects of their operation through his business work, specifically through a logistics contract that turned out to be moving things across borders that were not declared in any manifest. Victoria set her coffee down. He didn't know? We believed he didn't know initially. By the time I went to your house to warn him, we were less certain. He said it carefully, without accusation. I want to be clear. My belief at the time was that he was a peripheral figure who'd gotten caught in something larger than himself. The warning I gave him was genuine. But the fact that his name was in their system, and the fact that your company's communications are now being monitored by what appears to be the same network, is not a coincidence I can explain away. She was quiet for longer this time. Outside, through the front window of the coffee place, the street was doing its ordinary morning business. People walking, a delivery van double parked, a woman with a stroller waiting for the light. What do they want? Victoria asked. That's what I don't fully know yet. Your company operates in technology infrastructure, software, some hardware, government-adjacent contracts. Any of those sectors could be of interest to an organization that deals in information. We have 3 federal contracts, she said slowly. Data management for 2 mid-level agencies. Nothing classified. Nothing that would be... She stopped. There's 1 contract we're in the final stages of negotiating. Broader data architecture for a defense-adjacent bureau. It hasn't been announced publicly. Who knows about it internally? Board level, my senior legal team. 4 people in the technical division working on the proposal. She paused. Daniel, before he disappeared, was involved in building out the international logistics framework that eventually became the foundation for what we do now. I built the technology company on the infrastructure he helped establish. She said it evenly, but there was something underneath it that had weight. If there was something embedded in that original infrastructure, then the access they have now might predate your company by years, Ethan said. She absorbed that. Her jaw tightened slightly. So they'd been inside my walls before I even built them. Possibly. That's... She stopped herself from whatever word was coming next and took a slow breath instead. What do you need from me to understand this fully? I need to reach out to someone who still has clearance at the level I used to operate. Someone who can tell me the current status of Linchpin, whether it was ever fully dismantled or whether it's been operational in some form all this time. Do you have someone like that? I have one name, a man I worked with who left the program about 2 years after I did. He went into private intelligence consulting. We haven't spoken in 6 years, but he'll remember me. And if he won't talk, he'll talk. Ethan picked up his coffee. He owes me a conversation I never collected on. Victoria nodded slowly. She was recalibrating in real time. He could see it, the way she was reassembling information into a new shape, building a new architecture of understanding from pieces that had looked different an hour ago. She was good at it. Better than most people would be sitting across from someone telling them their company had a 7-month leak and their dead husband's past might be the reason for it. There's something else, she said. He waited. This morning when I was leaving the house, I noticed a car parked across the street. Dark gray sedan. It was there when I left. When I drove past on my way here, it was gone. She met his eyes. I've been in business long enough to know what surveillance looks like. I've just never had it pointed at me before. Ethan felt something shift in the back of his mind. The old calibration, the muscle memory of threat assessment that he'd never fully switched off. When you leave here, take a different route than you came. Don't go directly back to your office. Go somewhere public first. A store, a restaurant. Spend 20 minutes and then go in. You think they're watching me? I think if they've had access to your communications for 7 months, they know that you had an incident at the mansion 3 nights ago that resulted in 5 of their people being detained. They may be assessing whether you've connected the right dots. He paused. And they may now know that you've spoken to me. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something went through it. Meaning, I'm not the only one they're watching. Probably not. She looked at him steadily. Do you have a daughter, Walker? You know I do. Then act accordingly. She said it without drama, without turning it into a speech. Just a statement, direct and specific and not unkind. I have a daughter too. Whatever comes next, we factor that in. He held her gaze. Yes. They sat for a moment in the ordinary quiet of the coffee shop. The sound of the espresso machine, the low murmur of two old men at the counter debating something about last night's ball game. The extraordinary conversation they'd just had existed in the same air as all of it, which was how the worst things always worked. The world didn't stop its regular noise to accommodate what was actually happening. I'll reach out to my contact today, Ethan said. I'll have something more concrete for you within 48 hours. And until then? Until then, change your routine, not dramatically. Nothing that signals you've changed it. Small things. Different route to work. Don't hold meetings you haven't already scheduled. If anything feels wrong, trust that feeling. I've been trusting my feelings my entire career, she said, standing and pulling on her coat. It's the one instinct I've never managed to second-guess into the ground. He left 2 minutes after she did, by the back door. The name he was looking for was Marcus Teller. He found the number through 3 intermediaries, a former medic he'd served with, who now ran a private clinic in Nevada, who gave him a number for a logistics man in Phoenix, who gave him a burner contact that rang 4 times before a voice said simply, "Who is this?" "It's Walker," Ethan said, "from Coronado, from before." A silence of about 5 seconds. Then, "I wondered when you'd call." "You wondered?" "Let's say I've been following certain developments with a degree of interest." Marcus Teller's voice was the same as Ethan remembered. Careful, unhurried, like every sentence was being measured before it was released. "Where are you?" "The city." "Caldwell." Ethan went still. "You know, I know that a group of people connected to a network I've been tracking for 2 years made an attempt on a corporate server in the city 3 nights ago and failed because someone intervened." A pause. "I know that someone has your signature." "Talk to me about linchpin," Ethan said. "Not on this line, not today." Marcus's voice was even, but underneath it there was something. A tension, a careful awareness, the sound of a man who had been watching something long enough to be genuinely concerned about it. "Tomorrow. You know the rest stop on Route 9 between mile markers 41 and 42? "I know it." 10 in the morning. Come alone and come clean." A pause. "And Walker, be careful between now and then. If they know you are at the mansion, they've already started running your history. And your history leads places you'd rather they not go." The line went dead. Ethan sat in his car in the parking lot behind Halston's for a moment, engine off, thinking about what Marcus had not said as much as what he had. 2 years. Marcus had been tracking this for 2 years, which meant the network had been active for at least that long, probably longer, and people who were paid to watch these things had been watching it build back up, like weather gathering on a horizon that everyone hoped was moving in a different direction. He drove home. He had 6 hours before he needed to pick up Mia, and he used 4 of them going through everything he remembered about linchpin. Not from documents, which he no longer had access to, but from memory, which he'd always been better at than most people around him. The organization had started, as far as he understood it, as a privatized intelligence brokerage. Not a rogue state operation, not a terrorist enterprise. Something more complicated and, in some ways, more dangerous than either of those things. A collection of former intelligence professionals, logistics specialists, and financial operators who had decided that information was the most valuable commodity in the world and that they were tired of gathering it for governments that misused it. They sold to whoever paid. They had no ideology beyond price. And they protected their network with a thoroughness that made them almost impossible to fully trace, because every layer was designed to burn clean if the layer above it came apart. Ethan had spent 8 months of his last operational year hunting the edges of that network before his unit was redirected, and the official position became that linchpin had been sufficiently disrupted to no longer constitute an active threat. He'd argued against that assessment. He'd been overruled by people with more rank and less information. He'd left 6 months later. Not only because of that, but partly because of it. I was thinking about all of this, sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of water he hadn't touched and his eyes on the middle distance, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Walker." The voice was male, educated, with an accent he couldn't immediately place. Something European, possibly Eastern, possibly smoothed down by years of practice. I hope I'm not interrupting. Every muscle in Ethan's body went quiet, which was what his body did when it was preparing for something. Depends on who's asking, he said. Someone who appreciates economy, so let me be direct. A pause, brief and theatrical. You did impressive work at the Caldwell property the other evening. 5 men, our 5 men, I should say, handled before any of our objectives were met. That's not a small thing. We've been trying to understand how a subcontract security technician managed it, and the answer is, of course, that you're not a subcontract security technician. Ethan said nothing. He was listening to the background. No traffic, no ambient noise, a slight echo that suggested an enclosed space with hard walls, recording studio, parking garage, or a room with no furniture. We know who you are, the voice continued. We know what you were. We know about your daughter. Mia, yes? She attends Clearfield Elementary. She likes strawberry ice cream, and she has a teacher named Ms. Donovan who lets the class out at 3:15. The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Ethan kept his voice completely level. If you're trying to get my attention, you have it. Excellent. The man sounded genuinely pleased. Then let me tell you what we'd like. We'd like you to step away from the Caldwell matter entirely. No further investigation. No contact with Ms. Caldwell beyond what's required to disengage. Whatever you found on that drive, and we suspect you found something, given how quickly you requested a meeting, remains with you, unused. And in exchange, you return to being the quiet single father who fixes security systems and picks up his daughter at 3:15. Another pause. It's a good life, Mr. Walker. We have no interest in disturbing it. We have no interest in disturbing her. The word her landed like something physical. Ethan set his water glass down very carefully on the table. I need 24 hours, he said. Of course, we're reasonable people. The voice was warm, almost friendly. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. He sat for exactly 2 minutes, not moving. Then he called Mia's school, identified himself to the front office, and asked them to make sure she didn't leave with anyone other than him at pickup. The office administrator said certainly, and asked if everything was all right, and he said yes with the automatic ease of someone who had said yes to that question in bad situations many times before. Then he called Victoria. She picked up on the first ring. They contacted me, he said, a sharp intake of breath. How? Phone. Untraceable line. They know about Mia. Walker, listen, I need you to change where Lily is staying for the next few days. Don't use your regular nanny service. Is there family, someone off the grid from your usual pattern? My sister. She lives 40 minutes out. She doesn't use social media. She's not connected to anything related to my company. Perfect. Do it today. Don't tell anyone at your office. Don't call from your regular phone. Use a different one. Buy a prepaid if you have to. And don't... He stopped himself. Victoria. Yes. I'm sorry. This came to your door because of me, because I was there that night. A brief silence. You were there that night because you were protecting people. Don't apologize for that. I'm not apologizing for the intervention. I'm apologizing for what came after. Stop. Her voice was firm but not cold. Tell me what you need, and let's deal with what's actually in front of us. He exhaled once. I have a meeting tomorrow morning with a contact who's been tracking this network. After that, I'll have a better picture. I need you to stay calm and stay moving and not do anything that signals to your board or your staff that something is wrong. I run a billion-dollar company. Staying calm when things are wrong is essentially the job description. Good. Then keep doing it for one more day. He hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he went to the bedroom closet, moved aside a stack of Mia's off-season clothes, and opened the small fireproof lockbox bolted to the wall behind them. Inside was his service sidearm, cleaned and maintained as consistently as everything else in his life, and 2 loaded magazines and a folded sheet of paper with 3 emergency contact numbers written in his own handwriting. The only version of this list that existed, because a digital record was a record someone else could find. He checked the weapon without thinking about it, the way a musician runs scales, function, not performance. He put it back in the box, locked it, and went to pick up his daughter. Mia was quiet in the car on the way home, which was unusual. She sat in the back seat with her backpack on her lap and looked out the window, and he let her be quiet for a few minutes before he said, "How was your day?" Fine, she said. Fine, like actually fine, or fine like you don't want to talk about it. A pause. Kevin said something mean to Emma at lunch, and Emma cried, and then the teacher talked to Kevin, but Kevin didn't really understand why Emma was upset, I could tell. What did Kevin say? Mia repeated it, something about Emma's drawings being babyish. And the recounting was precise, almost forensic, the way Mia always described things she'd observed. Ethan listened carefully, because Mia wanted to be listened to carefully, not solved. That sounds like it was hard to watch, he said. It was. She was quiet for a moment. I told Emma her drawings were good, after. That was the right thing. Kevin doesn't know he's mean. I don't think he knows. She seemed genuinely puzzled by this. How does someone not know they're being mean? Sometimes people are carrying something that's bothering them, and they don't know how to say it, so it comes out sideways. Mia thought about this with the deliberateness she brought to anything she wasn't sure about. Like when you get quiet. He glanced in the rearview mirror. What do you mean? When something's wrong, you get quiet, instead of talking about it. He held the road for a moment. Is that what I do? Yes. She said it plainly. Not as an accusation, just as information. I don't mind. I just want you to know I notice. Ethan drove. I'll try to do better, he said. I know, Mia said, and she turned back to the window like it was settled. Ema to dinner. Pasta, because he was tired and pasta was simple, and Mia never complained about it, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her arrange her noodles into shapes before eating them, which she had done since she was 3, and which she would probably do until she was 30. He thought about the voice on the phone, about Clearfield Elementary, 315, Ms. Donovan, about how much information a person could gather about a life they'd never entered, just by watching from the right distance. He thought about what it meant that they had called him instead of simply moving on him. It meant they wanted him to step aside quietly. It meant they had a reason to prefer that over the alternative, which meant that whatever was in Victoria's systems, whatever they had been quietly extracting for 7 months, was still in progress. They weren't done. An allowed confrontation with a former SEAL who had just demonstrated he could dismantle their field team with his bare hands was not part of their preferred timeline, which meant he had something, some leverage, even if he didn't know its full shape yet. The call wasn't a threat. It was a negotiation. And people only negotiate when they're not certain they can simply take what they want. He helped Mia with her math homework after dinner. She was good at it, but pretended not to be, which he suspected was a social calculation she'd made, and which he found quietly impressive and also slightly worrying. And then he read with her for half an hour and got her into bed. She fell asleep faster than usual, worn out from the day, and he sat on the edge of her bed for a while in the dark, the way he did most nights. He was afraid. I was not a man who spent a lot of time acknowledging fear, but he could recognize it when it was sitting in his chest, and it was there now, specific and heavy, because the fear was not for himself. He'd made his peace with personal risk a long time ago, in ways that hadn't been entirely healthy and that he was still slowly working back from. The fear was for the 6-year-old asleep in front of him, who noticed when he was quiet, who told Emma her drawings were good, who had never done anything to deserve being mentioned in any sentence connected to linchpin or dark gray sedans or phone calls from men with carefully smoothed down accents. He sat there until the fear became something more manageable, not gone, never entirely gone, but organized, put into a shape he could work around. Then he went back to the kitchen table and pulled out the folded paper from his pocket with the 3 emergency numbers, and he looked at the first one for a long time before folding it back up and putting it away. Tomorrow he would meet Marcus at the rest stop on Route 9. Tomorrow he would know more. Tonight he needed to think clearly, which meant he needed sleep, which meant he needed to put the fear in its place and let the rest of his brain do what it had been trained over many years to do. He went to bed. He did not sleep easily, but he slept. The rest stop on Route 9 was the kind of place that existed purely as infrastructure, a parking lot, a cinder block bathroom building, a few picnic tables that nobody used, a vending machine with a crack in its plastic cover that had probably been there since the previous administration. Ethan arrived 12 minutes early and walked the perimeter twice before settling against the hood of his car where he could see every approach. Marcus arrived at 10 exactly, in a rental with Pennsylvania plates, and he'd aged in the 6 years since Ethan had last seen him. Thinner, with more gray at the temples and the particular watchfulness in the eyes of someone who had spent years looking for things other people couldn't see. They shook hands without much ceremony. "You look tired," Marcus said. "People keep saying that. You should sleep more." "I've been hearing that too." Ethan studied his face. "How bad is it?" Marcus leaned against the car beside him and looked at the empty highway. "Linchpin was never dismantled. You know that. You said it before they overruled you. What you don't know is what they became after the disruption." He paused. "The disruption pushed them inward. They lost their field infrastructure, most of their broker network, their primary communication channels. It took them about 3 years to rebuild. When they came back smaller and more careful and significantly smarter about how they moved." "What do they want with Caldwell Technologies?" "Caldwell Technologies has the inside track on a federal data architecture contract worth about $900 million over 7 years. If they win that contract, they become the backbone of data management for 3 significant government bureaus." Marcus looked at him. "Linchpin wants a door inside that architecture before it's built. Not to disrupt it, to use it, access to federal data flow at that scale, invisible, pre-installed before anyone knows to look. That's not a theft. That's a position. A permanent one." Ethan stared at the highway. They were going to use the company's own infrastructure. The same infrastructure that Daniel Caldwell helped build, which was already partially their creation. Marcus's voice was careful. "Daniel didn't know what he was helping build, Walker. We were as certain as we could be. The logistics framework he established was built on contracts and partnerships that Linchpin had specifically engineered to look legitimate. He was a clean face on a dirty foundation. And when he found out? We think he found out about 8 months before he disappeared. We think someone inside Linchpin realized he'd found out." A pause. "We don't know what happened after that." The not knowing sat between them for a moment. "They called me," Ethan said. "Last night. Told me to walk away." Marcus nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "They don't want a scene. They're close. 7 months of access, and they're probably 60–70% through building what they need to build inside Caldwell's systems. Another few months and the door's in place. If she wins the federal contract and deploys that architecture, it's over. They're inside something that would take years to find and even longer to remove. So we stop the contract. You stop the contract, you destroy her company. The contract is the company's future. Everything she's built in 3 years is structured around winning it." Marcus looked at him. "There's another option." "Tell me." "You find the back door they've already built. You document it. You bring it forward through the right channels. Not official channels, because official channels have people in them who've been bought, but the right channels. You expose the full network, which I have been building a file on for 22 months, and you burn it down completely this time." "And what do they do while I'm doing that?" "They try to stop you." Marcus said it plainly, "which is why you can't do it alone, and why you needed to talk to me before you went much further." Ethan looked at him. "You've been building toward this." "For 2 years, yes." No apology in Marcus's voice, just the calm statement of a man who had been playing a long game and was now approaching its end. "I needed someone who understood the original network well enough to move inside it without making mistakes. I've been watching for the right moment. And the charity event was the moment. You showing up at the charity event was a variable I did not plan for. But yes." The closest thing to a smile that Marcus's face seemed to produce. It accelerated the timeline considerably. Ethan stood up straight from the car. He looked at the empty lot, the cinder block building, the cracked vending machine. He thought about Mia asleep in her bed last night, and the fear he'd organized into something manageable. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who recognized a melody through a closed door. He thought about Victoria Caldwell sitting at her desk in the 43rd floor corner office, with a crayon drawing on the wall, holding together a company and a daughter, and a grief she'd never had the full story of, and doing it without letting any of it show on her face until it slipped through when she didn't know he was paying attention. "Tell me what you need from me," Ethan said. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a drive, thicker than the one Victoria had given Ethan, heavier, the kind of drive that held a lot. "Everything I have," he said. 22 months of it. And your help getting the rest." Ethan took the drive. He turned it over in his hand once, the same way he'd turned over the decision all night without quite reaching it consciously, and then he put it in his pocket. "All right," he said. He drove back from Route 9 with Marcus's drive sitting on the passenger seat and the windows down because he needed the cold air and the road noise to keep his thinking clean. The situation had a shape now. Before it had been fragments, the mansion, the song, the routing signature, the phone call. Now it had a spine, a logic, a sequence of causes that led to where they currently were. That was both better and worse than not knowing. Better because you could plan against something with a shape. Worse because the shape was bigger than he'd initially estimated, and the margin for error was correspondingly smaller. He stopped at a gas station 20 minutes outside the city, filled the tank, and stood at the pump thinking through the immediate priorities in order. First, secure Mia and keep her secured without alerting her that anything was wrong. Second, get Victoria fully briefed on what Marcus had told him, because she needed the complete picture now, but not a partial version, not a managed version, the whole thing. Third, begin working through Marcus's file and identify the specific components of the back door that Linchpin had been building inside Caldwell's systems. Fourth, and most complicated, figure out who the right channels were. Marcus had said not official channels, because official channels had been compromised, and Ethan believed that he'd believed it for a long time, but not official didn't mean not institutional. It meant finding the people inside institutions who were still clean, and that was a much harder search than it sounded. He paid for the gas and got back in the car. His phone had 2 messages. One from Mia's school, routine communication about a field trip form he needed to sign, nothing alarming. One from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be Victoria calling from the prepaid phone she'd apparently already obtained, which told him she was moving faster than he'd asked her to. He called her back. "How did it go?" she said. "Better than I expected and worse than I hoped. Can you get to a neutral location this afternoon? Not your office, not your home." "My sister's place. I'm taking Lily there tonight anyway." "Good, I'll come to you. Text me the address from this number." Is my sister going to be in danger by having us there?" Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. "Not immediately. The people we're dealing with want to operate quietly. Visible escalation isn't in their interest right now. As long as you move without drawing attention, you're buying us time." "That's not as reassuring as I think you meant it to be." "I know." He paused. "I'm sorry. I could give you a cleaner answer, but it wouldn't be accurate." A brief silence. "I'll take the accurate one." She hung up. He made one more call before pulling back onto the highway, to Mrs. Patrice, asking if she could take Mia after school today and possibly overnight. Patrice asked no questions, just said yes, and he reminded himself for the 100th time that he owed that woman more than he would ever know how to properly repay. Victoria's sister lived in a house 43 minutes from the city, in a neighborhood that had the quiet, unremarkable character of a place where nothing much happened and nobody was famous. The houses were modest and close together, and the street had 2 oak trees that had been there long enough to buckle the sidewalk. Her name was Rachel. She was 34, and she met Ethan at the door with the expression of a woman who had been told an abbreviated version of the situation and was choosing, with visible effort, to stay calm. "Victoria's in the back," Rachel said. "Lily's in the yard." Ethan stepped inside. The house smelled like something baking and like a household where a real person actually lived. Shoes by the door, a jacket thrown over a chair, a half-finished cup of tea on the counter. He felt himself relax slightly, involuntarily, the way the body sometimes responds to evidence of ordinary life. Through the kitchen window, he could see Lily in the backyard, crouching near a flower bed, with the focused attention of a child who had found something interesting in the dirt. She looked unhurt and unbothered, and the relief of that was sharper than he'd expected. Victoria was at the kitchen table with a laptop and 3 pages of handwritten notes and a look that said she had not been sitting still. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me everything." He sat. He told her. He went through what Marcus had explained. The rebuilding of Linchpin after the disruption, the back door being constructed inside her systems, the federal contract as the target, and Daniel's role in the original infrastructure, which he delivered as directly and carefully as he could. He watched her face throughout. She didn't interrupt, didn't react visibly to the parts that were clearly landing hard, just listened with the particular stillness of someone who is hearing things they had suspected and are now having those suspicions confirmed in a shape they hadn't quite imagined. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He didn't know, she said finally. Marcus's position, and mine, is that he didn't know. Not when he built it. The framework he created was what it appeared to be, a legitimate logistics infrastructure. The person building it wouldn't know what it was for. But later he found out. We believe so, yes. She looked at her hands, which were flat on the table. He never told me. No. He just disappeared. There was something in her voice that wasn't anger and wasn't grief exactly, or maybe it was both of those things processed down into something quieter by 3 years of living with the unresolved ending. He found out what he'd been part of without knowing it, and he didn't. He didn't come to me. He just disappeared. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, I think he was trying to protect you. I know that's probably true. She said it without warmth. I know that's probably exactly what he was doing. He always thought protecting people meant keeping things from them. A pause. It's a very common mistake. The words landed in a way that he suspected she intended them to, at least partially, for him. He didn't deflect it. You're right, he said. It is. She looked at him then, directly, and he held the look without dropping it, which was harder than he expected. What do we do? She said. Marcus and I work through his file and identify the exact components of the back door. That's technical work. It'll take 2, maybe 3 days. While we're doing that, I need something from you. Name it. The 4 people on your technical team who know about the federal contract proposal. I need to know which of them has had unusual contact with outside parties in the last year. Not necessarily suspicious contact, just unusual. Travel, consultancies, secondary contracts, anything that represents a point of connection to the outside of your normal network. She absorbed this. You think one of my people is feeding information? I think Linchpin doesn't operate without inside access. The routing signature in your communications log means they had a key, and keys don't appear from nowhere. Someone gave them an opening, whether knowingly or not. Whether knowingly or not, she repeated slowly. What does that mean in practice? It means the person might be compromised without fully understanding they're compromised. It might have started as something small, a conversation at a conference, a consulting arrangement that seemed legitimate, a friendship with someone whose affiliations they didn't fully understand. Linchpin is patient and methodical. They don't usually recruit aggressively. They create conditions. Victoria nodded once, absorbing this with the systematic thoroughness he'd come to expect from her. I'll pull the personnel files and outside engagement records for all 4. I can do that without going through my regular channels. I have direct access to HR documentation. Do it from this location, not from anything connected to your company's servers. Understood. She hesitated, then, Walker. Yeah, if this goes where you think it's going, if we expose the full network and burn it down, in your words, what happens to my company? To the contract? It was the right question to ask, and he appreciated that she was asking it rather than pushing it to the side. The contract review process would likely be paused during an investigation. Whether you ultimately win it depends on how the exposure is handled and who handles it. A clean exposure, properly documented, with you positioned as a cooperating party who identified and eliminated a threat from within your own systems. That's a very different story than if it comes out messy. So the way we do it matters as much as whether we do it. Yes. She sat with that. Outside through the window, Lily had found something in the dirt that apparently merited picking up, and she was examining it with both hands, turning it in the afternoon light. She remembers more than I realized, Victoria said, watching her daughter. Children usually do, Ethan said. They just don't always have the words for it. She talked about Daniel last night, more than she has in months. A pause. She said she remembered him being afraid of something, near the end. She said she thought about it sometimes, but couldn't explain it properly. She described it as him being quiet in the wrong way. Victoria looked back at Ethan. She said it reminded her of how you were, in the hallway. Before you came through the door, Ethan felt something shift slightly, somewhere in the vicinity of his chest. She's wrong about that, he said. I wasn't afraid. She said she didn't mean afraid like scared. She said she meant the kind of quiet where someone is deciding something. Victoria's eyes held his steadily. She's 7 years old, and she put that into words. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at Lily through the window. She's going to be formidable, he said. She already is. A small, tired, genuine smile crossed Victoria's face, and it was different from the near smiles he'd seen in her office. Less managed, less aware of itself. I'll get you the personnel files. He drove back to the city and spent the rest of the afternoon at Marcus's rented workspace, a short-term office suite in an anonymous building near the financial district, the kind of place where businesses came and went fast enough that nobody tracked the tenants with any rigor. Marcus had set up across 2 folding tables, his own equipment, the drive he'd given Ethan, and a secondary system that ran air-gapped from any network connection. They worked in near silence for the first 2 hours, which was its own language. The kind of collaborative focus that develops between people who have worked together under pressure before and don't need to fill space with noise. The file Marcus had built over 22 months was thorough in a way that made Ethan both relieved and angry. Relieved because the documentation existed, angry because the fact that Marcus had needed to build it privately meant the official systems that should have been catching this had failed completely. The back door was elegant, in the way that dangerous things sometimes were. It wasn't a crude intrusion. It was a series of small modifications to Caldwell's data architecture, adjustments so subtle that they would survive a standard security audit because they didn't look like damage. They looked like normal system optimizations. Each one individually was meaningless. In aggregate, assembled in the right sequence, they created a passive channel, a data flow that would route a specific category of government information through a node that Linchpin controlled, invisibly, indefinitely. How long has it been in construction? Ethan asked. 7 months, which matches your log findings. They're about 2/3 complete. Marcus pointed to a section of the documentation. These 3 components are already in place and stable. These 2 are partially implemented. This final one hasn't been touched yet. It's the activation element. Without it, the channel exists but can't transmit. So if we remove the existing components before they add the final one, the whole structure collapses and they have to start over, which they can't do quickly because starting over means reestablishing inside access. And if we identify and close the access point at the same time, they're locked out. Ethan sat back. Can we document the existing components in a form that's usable as evidence? Already done. I have technical documentation, metadata trails, and 3 separate chain of custody records that would hold up to scrutiny from anyone qualified to evaluate them. Marcus looked at him. The question is still who we bring it to. I've been thinking about that. Ethan had been thinking about it since Route 9, turning it over alongside everything else. There's a woman at the Inspector General's office in the Defense Department. Her name is Sandra Okafor. I did one joint operation with her team about 8 years ago. She was OIG then, and she's still there. She stayed because she's one of the people who actually believes in the institution and is angry enough about what's wrong with it to keep working from inside. You trust her? I trust that she's been building a reputation for 9 years on completely independent findings. She's made enemies of people who should be her allies if she was operating with any other agenda. That's the best indicator I have. Do you have a contact for her? No, but I know someone who does. He thought of the former medic in Nevada who had connected him to Marcus. The long chain of people who had once done work that put them adjacent to each other and had since dispersed into civilian life but never entirely disconnected. It'll take a day, maybe 2. Marcus nodded. In the meantime, he pulled up another section of his file. There's something else you need to see. Ethan leaned forward. What Marcus showed him was a communication log, not from Caldwell's systems, but from Linchpin's own internal network, which Marcus had been partially inside for 4 months without their knowledge. It was fragmented and incomplete because their encryption was sophisticated, but Marcus had managed to reconstruct portions of it through methods Ethan didn't ask about in detail. One name appeared in the reconstructed fragments with enough regularity to be significant. The name was Harlan Briggs. He was the Senior Vice President of Technical Development at Caldwell Technologies. He was one of the 4 people who knew about the federal contract proposal. And 3 months ago, according to a fragment Marcus had pulled, someone inside Linchpin's internal network had referred to him as their current primary interface. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment. Does Victoria know him well? Marcus asked. She hasn't said. But he's Senior VP. That's not an entry-level hire. She probably brought him in personally. That's going to be a difficult conversation. Most of the relevant conversations lately have been. Ethan stood and stretched because he'd been hunched over the table for 3 hours and his back was reminding him that he was 37 and not 24. What's his access level to the systems where the back door is being built? Root level. He could have implemented the existing components himself, or given someone else the credentials to do it without triggering internal alerts. Marcus pulled up a secondary file. His outside engagement history shows a consulting relationship with a logistics technology firm in Vienna that was established 18 months ago. The firm is a shell. I tracked it through 4 holding companies before it dead-ended in a structure that matches Lynchpin's financial signature. So he's been theirs for at least 18 months. At least. Ethan thought about Victoria pulling personnel files from her sister's kitchen table on a prepaid laptop, methodically and without complaint, because that was what the situation required. He thought about what it was going to be like to tell her that one of the people she trusted with her company's most significant opportunity was the mechanism through which that company had been used. "I'll handle that," Ethan said. "I'll tell her." Marcus looked at him with a careful neutrality. "She's not just a principal to you." It wasn't quite a question. "She's someone in a bad situation who deserves accurate information," Ethan said. Marcus held the neutral look for another second, then returned to his screen. "Of course." He called Victoria at 7 that evening from a payphone, an actual payphone, one of the few remaining ones, outside a diner on the east side of the city that he used sometimes because it was untraceable by default rather than by design. "I need to tell you something about one of the 4 names," he said. She was quiet for a beat. "Briggs." He paused. "How did you know?" "Because I pulled the records like you asked, and I found 2 things I couldn't explain. A secondary email address tied to his access credentials that doesn't appear in any official IT documentation, and a travel record showing he was in Vienna 3 times last year on what was logged as personal leave." Her voice was even, completely, carefully even. "I've been sitting with it for 4 hours trying to find an alternative explanation. There isn't one." "I know." A pause. Long enough that he could hear her breathing. "I hired him 3 years ago. 8 months after Daniel disappeared, when I was trying to rebuild everything on my own. He came recommended through a professional network, his background checked clean, and he understood exactly what I was trying to build." Another pause. "He understood it because they sent him." "Probably." "They sent him, and then they waited, and he helped me build a company that they were going to use." Something shifted in her voice. The evenness cracked slightly, not dramatically, just enough to let through the pressure that had been building behind it. "He was in my building for 3 years. He came to Lily's birthday party last spring." Ethan held the phone and let her be angry, because she had the right to it, and because trying to process it out of her at this stage would be both useless and unkind. "I want him out of my building," she said. "Not yet. If you move on him now, you alert the network and they accelerate. We need to contain the information until we have the channel to Sandra Okafor confirmed and the documentation ready to transfer. 3 days, maybe 4. 3 days of letting him sit in my building with access to my systems. With access that Marcus and I can monitor. If he makes a move toward the final component, we'll see it coming." A longer silence. He could hear faintly the sound of Lily's voice somewhere in the background of where Victoria was, talking to someone, Rachel probably. The words indistinct, but the tone ordinary and unconcerned. "Fine," Victoria said. 3 days. "I'll be in touch tomorrow." "Walker." Her voice had gone back to level, but it was a different kind of level than before. Quieter. Less controlled and more genuine. "How do you do this? Live like this? Knowing what you know about how things actually work?" He thought about it, genuinely rather than reflexively. "You pick the thing that matters most in a given moment and you focus on it. You don't try to hold everything at once." "What's the thing that matters most right now?" "Lily's voice in the background," he said. "That's what matters most." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." He hung up and walked back to his car through the cool evening, hands in his pockets, and drove to Mrs. Patrice's to pick up Mia. The next 2 days moved in a particular rhythm that Ethan recognized from operational experience, the combination of intense focused work and enforced patience, that came when you were building toward a deadline you didn't fully control. He and Marcus worked through the technical documentation in long sessions, refining the evidence package into a form that was as airtight as they could make it. He exchanged brief, encrypted communications with Victoria twice a day, morning and evening, nothing that required a long conversation, just status and confirmation that she and Lily were stable at Rachel's and that Briggs had not deviated from his normal pattern. On the evening of the second day, through the former medic's chain of contacts, he reached Sandra Okafor. She answered her personal cell on the third ring, and when he gave his name, she said, "I heard you'd left the service," in a tone that suggested she'd heard other things too and was interested in which ones would come up. "I did, 8 years ago. And now you're calling me at 8 in the evening on a private number." "Yes." "Which means whatever you have isn't something you wanted to put through official channels." "Correct." "Tell me why I shouldn't just refer you to the standard intake process." "Because the standard intake process has been compromised at a level I can document, and because what I'm handing you is 22 months of independent fieldwork on a network that your office has listed as inactive for over a decade." He paused. "And because you spent 9 years making enemies of people who shouldn't be your enemies, which tells me you already know the standard intake process has a problem." A silence of about 4 seconds. Then, "Who built the 22 months?" "Marcus Teller, former JSOC Intelligence. You may have crossed his work before without knowing the origin." "I know his name." Another pause, and in it he heard her thinking. The same kind of measured, unhurried assessment he recognized from the one joint operation they'd run together years ago. "How soon can you get the documentation to me? How soon can you receive it in a way that doesn't go through a logged channel?" "Day after tomorrow. I'm in Atlanta for a conference. I can step outside the official schedule." "I'll be there," Ethan said. He told Marcus. Marcus spent the remaining time compressing and preparing the file for transfer and building an additional verification layer so that the provenance of every piece of evidence was unambiguous. Ethan spent those same hours thinking through the residual logistics, the things that needed to happen at Caldwell's end before and immediately after the transfer, the timing of Briggs's removal, the sequence of steps that would give Victoria the cleanest possible path through the aftermath. And he thought about the conversation he still hadn't fully had with her. Not about Briggs, not about Linchpin, but the other one. The one about what he'd been carrying since he left the Navy, since Mia was born. Since he'd built a life designed primarily to stay small and invisible, because small and invisible felt like the safest thing he could offer his daughter. He was not sure when that conversation needed to happen, or whether it was even his to initiate. He knew only that something had opened in him since the night of the charity event, something he'd kept very tightly closed for a very long time, and that he couldn't quite get it to shut again. He didn't try to force it. He let it stay open and he got on with the work. Atlanta was gray and raining when he arrived. Sandra Okafor met him in a hotel lobby bar that was quiet at that hour, full of conference attendees who had migrated to their rooms or the restaurant, leaving the bar to the bartender and 2 businessmen watching sports on the far screen. She was compact and precise in the way he remembered, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the expression of someone who hadn't started the day, expecting this meeting and had decided that was fine. They shook hands. They ordered coffee. He laid it out for her in 45 minutes, structured and specific, the way you brief someone who knows how to receive a brief. She asked 7 questions, each one sharp and well-placed, and he answered all 7 without deflection because deflection was not something that worked with Sandra Okafor and never had. When he finished, she sat with the drive Marcus had prepared in her hands and turned it over once. 22 months, she said. Yes. And the access point, the inside contact at Caldwell. Harlan Briggs, Senior VP. The documentation on his connection to the network is in Section 4 of the file. Phone records, financial trace, communication fragments from their internal network. You're going to remove him before or after this moves forward officially. After your confirmation that the channel is secure enough to move forward without alerting the network. I don't want him to run before the wider structure is exposed. She nodded slowly. The company, Caldwell Technologies. Victoria Caldwell has been fully cooperative since the moment she understood the situation. She's the one who gave me the initial log that led to the routing signature. She's been operating at personal risk for the last 4 days without compromising the investigation. Sandra looked at him with a particular quality of attention that he recognized from years ago. The look that meant she was evaluating not just the information but the person delivering it. "You know her." "I know her," he said, simply, without elaboration. Sandra accepted that with a small nod and looked back at the drive. "I'll need 48 hours to review this and identify the right people on my end. People I'm personally certain of. Take the time you need." "And Walker." She looked up at him. "When this breaks, and if the documentation is what you say it is, it will break loudly. The backstory is going to surface, including your involvement with the original linchpin monitoring a decade ago, including the fact that you were overruled on the inactive designation." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" He thought about Mia, who noticed when he was quiet and had opinions about ice cream, and thought Kevin probably didn't understand he was being mean. He thought about what prepared even meant, for someone who had spent 12 years trying to be invisible. "It doesn't matter whether I'm prepared," he said. "It needs to happen." Sandra held his gaze for a moment, then tucked the drive into her inside jacket pocket. "I'll be in touch," she said. He flew back that evening and drove from the airport through the dark city and stopped at Mrs. Patrice's, where Mia was already asleep on the couch under a blanket with a book open across her chest, because she had apparently been in the middle of a chapter and had not made it to the end. He carried her home. He got her into bed. He sat in the kitchen with the light over the stove on, not enough to call it being up, just enough to see by. And he thought about the drive in Sandra Okafor's inside pocket, moving through Atlanta toward whatever came next. He thought about Daniel Caldwell, who had tried to protect his family by disappearing and had instead left the people he loved with a wound that didn't have clean edges. He thought about what that choice had cost. Not just Victoria, not just Lily, but Daniel himself, wherever he had ended up. The terrible arithmetic of the decision to carry something alone instead of sharing it. He thought about how many times he had made the same calculation and arrived at the same answer, and how many times that answer had cost him something he didn't know he was losing until it was gone. He didn't have a remedy for any of it. He had the next step, and the step after that, and the work in front of him, and across the city in a house that smelled like something baking and had oak trees out front. A woman was probably sitting at a kitchen table reviewing documents with the same determined focus she brought to everything, and next to her a 7-year-old was asleep in a borrowed bed with no idea how much her world had almost changed. That was what he had. For now, it was enough to keep moving. Sandra Okafor called 41 hours after Atlanta. Ethan was in Marcus's workspace when the call came, the two of them midway through a final review of the technical documentation, cross-checking component references, making sure the chain of evidence held at every link. He stepped into the hallway to take it. "The file is what you said it was," Sandra said. No greeting, no preamble. He'd always respected that about her. "I've had 2 people I trust completely review the technical components. The backdoor construction is confirmed, the financial trace on Briggs holds, and the communication fragments from the internal network are authenticated. And the channel? I have 4 people on my end who are clean. I'm certain of 3 and 90% certain of the 4th, which is high enough for me to proceed." A pause. "This is going to move fast once it starts. The moment we initiate formal proceedings, Linchpin's network will detect the activity and they'll start burning their own infrastructure. We have maybe a 6-hour window between initiation and the point where the most critical nodes go dark. What do you need from our end? The backdoor components need to be documented in place, confirmed active, at the moment of initiation. If Briggs has already removed them to cover tracks, we lose the physical evidence inside the system. They haven't touched the components. Marcus has been monitoring the access logs continuously. Everything is still in place. Then we move tomorrow, 6 a.m. She gave him the secure protocol, a specific encrypted channel, a confirmation code, the sequence of steps by which Marcus would provide real-time system verification while Sandra's team initiated on their end. "One more thing, Walker. The people I'm coordinating with need to know about your prior involvement with the linchpin monitoring, the overruling, all of it. It becomes part of the record." "I know. You understand what that means for you publicly?" "Yes." A short pause. "I always thought that inactive designation was wrong," she said, quietly, without drama. Just a statement of something she'd apparently been carrying for a while. "For what it's worth something," he said. He went back inside and told Marcus. They spent the remaining hours of that evening preparing the verification protocol, the technical sequence that would allow Marcus to confirm, in real time, the live presence of the backdoor components at the moment Sandra's team needed the confirmation. It was precise work, the kind that didn't allow for errors of either overconfidence or excessive caution. At 10:30, Ethan drove to Rachel's house. Victoria met him at the door. She'd heard his car and come out before he knocked, which told him she'd been waiting, though she wouldn't have described it that way. She was wearing a gray sweater that wasn't her usual register, softer, less deliberate than what she wore in professional contexts, and her hair was down, and she looked like a person who had been living for 6 days in a kind of extended holding pattern and was extremely ready for it to resolve. "Tomorrow," he said. She exhaled, not with relief exactly, more with the release of tension that comes when a date finally arrives after too much anticipating. "Walk me through it." They sat at Rachel's kitchen table, the same one she'd been working at for 6 days, and he took her through the sequence. 6 a.m. initiation. The 6-hour window. Briggs would be contacted by Sandra's team at his home address before he reached the office, not by local law enforcement, by federal agents coordinated through the OIG channel, which meant it would be quiet and it would be thorough and it would be irrefutable. "His access credentials will be suspended at the same moment he's contacted," Ethan said. "Your IT director, Chen, the one you said has been with you since the beginning, she'll receive a direct call from Marcus explaining what's being removed from your systems and why. She'll need to be prepared for that. I'll call Linda tonight and tell her to expect an early call from someone I trust. I won't give her details. She doesn't need them yet. But I don't want her blindsided." "Good." Victoria had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked at the table for a moment, then up at him. "What happens to my company after this? Honestly." "Honestly, the next 4 to 6 weeks will be difficult. There will be a formal security review of your systems, conducted by a team Sandra designates. The federal contract process will be paused pending the review. Your board will need to be briefed, which means controlling the narrative carefully and quickly." "I can control a narrative." "I know you can. The review will ultimately confirm that the backdoor was introduced without your knowledge or complicity, and that you cooperated fully with its identification and removal. That's a defensible position. Better than defensible. It's the truth, and the documentation supports it completely." He paused. "The contract is probably delayed 6 months, not lost. That's my estimate, not a guarantee." She nodded slowly. 6 months I can manage." She paused. "What about you? Sandra said your prior involvement becomes part of the record." "She told you that?" "She called me directly this afternoon to confirm my cooperation for tomorrow and to explain the scope of the official record." Victoria looked at him steadily. "She said your name will be attached to the original monitoring effort, the overruling, and the current exposure. She said it would be public." "Yes." "And the life you've been living, the quiet life." "Won't be quiet anymore for a while," he said. "That's accurate." "Are you—" She stopped, started differently. "Mia. She's 6 years old and she's resilient, and she has Mrs. Patrice, who is worth more than most protective details I've ever worked with." He said it with a flatness that he knew was partly deflection, but also partly genuine conviction. "I've thought about this. I'm not walking into tomorrow without having thought about it." "I know you have." She set down the teacup. "I just wanted to say, whatever happens after, whatever attention or inconvenience or difficulty comes from this being public, I want you to know that I'm aware of what it costs you, and I don't take it as a given." Ethan looked at her. He had been in many difficult situations, in many configurations of danger and responsibility, and he had learned over the years that most people in crisis fell into one of 2 categories. The ones who, under enough pressure, eventually made it about themselves, their fear, their loss, their reputation, and the ones who, under the same pressure, somehow managed to keep seeing outward. Victoria had been seen outward for 6 straight days, in circumstances that gave her every justification to do otherwise. He didn't know what to do with that entirely. He was better at cataloging what people were than at knowing what to do about it. "Thank you," he said, and meant it without qualification. She nodded. They sat for a moment in Rachel's quiet kitchen. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask." "When you left the Navy, when you became this, The quiet single father with the careful life. Was that a choice you made because you wanted it, or because you thought it was the safest thing you could offer Mia? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than the deflection it invited. Both, he said. At the beginning, mostly the second. I thought, the smaller I made my footprint, the less of my history could reach her. If I didn't exist in any way that was visible, nothing I'd been part of could find its way to her door. And did it work? He smiled, briefly and without much humor. Someone mentioned her school and her ice cream preference on a phone call 6 days ago, so partially. And now? Is it still about keeping the footprint small? He looked at the kitchen window, dark at this hour, showing nothing but the reflection of the room. I think I've been confusing protection with absence, he said slowly, like if I just didn't need anything, didn't want anything beyond what Mia needed, didn't take up any more space than was strictly necessary, then nothing bad could reach us. But you can't actually protect someone by shrinking yourself. You can only make yourself too small to be of use. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Daniel thought the same way. Keep the big things away by keeping them secret. Handle it alone. Don't let anyone else carry any of it. She paused. I was angry at him for a long time for that. Past tense? Getting there. She picked up the cold teacup and set it in the sink. I'm not sure anger is the right container for it anymore. It's more like grief with complicated edges. He understood that. He understood it from his own inventory of things he'd carried for years in containers that didn't quite fit. He left at 11:30. At the door, Rachel's porch light throwing pale yellow across the steps. He turned back. Victoria. She was still in the doorway. Yes. After tomorrow. When the immediate part of this is over. He stopped, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because saying it required a kind of openness he was unpracticed at and wasn't entirely sure he wouldn't do badly. I'd like to not disappear, if that makes sense. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, the careful management parting just enough to let through something honest. It makes sense, she said. I'd like that too. He drove home through the dark city, and for the first time in 6 days, his chest felt something other than the particular compression of accumulated threat. The morning of the operation arrived gray and cold, with a low ceiling of cloud that turned the city the color of old pewter. Ethan was at Marcus's workspace by 5:15. Marcus was already there, had been there since 4, running final checks on the verification protocol with the focused quiet of a man who understood that this was the last point at which errors were catchable. At 5:58, the encrypted channel opened. Sandra's confirmation came through at 6:01. Initiation confirmed, federal coordination in progress, Briggs being contacted at his residence at that moment. Marcus began the real-time verification sequence. What followed was 2 hours of technical work that looked, from the outside, like 2 men staring at screens in silence. But inside that silence was the actual dismantling of something that had been constructed over years, painstakingly, invisibly, inside the architecture of a company built by a woman who had no idea what had been embedded in its foundations. Marcus documented each component as Sandra's team moved through the system with their designated technical specialists, pulling the pieces of the back door one by one, recording their specifications, establishing the chain of evidence that would make each one provable in any proceeding that followed. Ethan's job in those 2 hours was to monitor the secondary channel, the linchpin network activity that Marcus had been partially inside, and watch for signs that they detected the operation and were moving to burn their infrastructure. The first sign came at 7:44, a spike in encrypted traffic across 3 nodes that Marcus had identified as linchpin relay points. Then, 17 minutes later, a cascade, communications going dark in sequence, the network eating itself from the edges inward, exactly as Sandra had predicted. They know, Ethan said. How much of the documentation is confirmed? Marcus asked Sandra on the channel, without looking up from his screen. 83% complete. We need 12 more minutes. You have maybe 8 before the internal nodes go dark. Then we work faster. Her voice was perfectly level. In the background, he could hear other voices, her team, and the sound of people doing complicated work quickly. They got 11 minutes. At the 11-minute mark, the last relevant node in Linchpin's accessible network went dark. But Sandra had what she needed, Verification complete, she said. Documentation is sealed and logged. We're done. Marcus sat back in his chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Ethan called Victoria. She picked up immediately. Is it done? It's done. A sound on her end that wasn't quite anything. Not a word, not a cry. Something more like the noise a person makes when they've been holding themselves very rigid for a very long time, and something finally releases. Then, quietly, okay. Sandra's team will contact you formally within the hour. Linda Chen will be called in the next 15 minutes. You should go back to your office today. Not rushed, normally, same time you'd usually arrive. Act as if it's a regular day until the formal contact comes through. I can do that. I know you can. Walker. A pause. Thank you. He didn't know what to say to that exactly, so he said, I'll talk to you soon, and hung up, which was not a perfect response, but was an honest one. Basic. The weeks that followed were, as he'd predicted, difficult in the specific ways that the aftermath of large, necessary disruptions tend to be difficult. Not dramatic, not violent, but exhaustingly procedural. Ethan gave 3 separate formal interviews to Sandra's team, all recorded, all comprehensive, covering the original linchpin monitoring, the overruling, and every step of the current exposure. The record he'd always known would eventually exist was now being built carefully and on his terms, which was better than the alternative. His name appeared in reporting about 3 weeks after the operation. Not front page, the story was too technical for most general outlets to lead with, but in the specific corners of journalism that covered national security and corporate malfeasance, the details came out with enough accuracy to be uncomfortable. Former Navy SEAL, quiet civilian life, single father, re-engaged with a network he'd originally tracked a decade earlier. The framing was largely neutral. One outlet made it slightly heroic in a way that embarrassed him. One made it slightly suspicious in a way that Sandra's office corrected within 48 hours. Mia came home from school 3 days after the story appeared and said, Kevin says his dad saw your name on the news. Ethan was making dinner. He set down the spoon. What did you say? I said my dad works in security, and sometimes security is in the news. She shrugged with the pragmatic economy of someone who had processed a thing and moved on from it. Kevin said that was cool. I said it was just his job. Ethan looked at his daughter. Is that right? He said. That's what you always say when I ask about your job, that it's just a job. I do say that. Are you going to tell me more now? He served the pasta and sat down across from her. Yes, he said, but not all at once. A little at a time, as you're ready for it. She considered this arrangement. Okay, she said, and picked up her fork. He thought sometimes about what it meant to be a parent, which was something he thought about often, though never with any conclusion. The specific impossibility of it was this. You were trying to give a person the tools to navigate a world you couldn't fully control or predict, using tools you'd built from your own experiences, which were imperfect and specific to you and would not map precisely onto another person's life. You were essentially doing improvised construction in the dark, hoping the structure held. The best he could say for himself was that he hadn't stopped trying. He'd made the shelter smaller than it needed to be, had confused smallness with safety, as he'd told Victoria. But the foundation was honest. He showed up. He paid attention. He answered questions truthfully, in amounts appropriate to the age of the asker. He tried, imperfectly and with regular failure, to let Mia see the parts of him that were uncertain and fallible, rather than performing a competence he didn't always feel. That was all he had. He offered it without pretense that it was more. Harlan Briggs was formally charged 6 weeks after the operation. The charges were multiple and serious, and the trail of evidence was sufficiently complete that his legal team spent their first week reviewing documentation rather than disputing it. He did not ultimately go to trial. He cooperated, in exchange for arrangements that Ethan neither oversaw nor particularly wanted to think about, and through his cooperation, 3 additional linchpin nodes that had survived the initial burn were identified and shut down. Linchpin, as a functioning network, was finished. Not in the neat, definitive way that official designations suggested. These things always left residue. But functionally, operationally, as an entity that could execute the kind of sustained long-term intelligence operation it had been running inside Caldwell's systems. The people who had built it were either in custody, cooperating in exchange for protections. Ethan didn't control, or had scattered to extents that made them individually manageable rather than collectively dangerous. Marcus accepted a formal consulting arrangement with Sandra's office. Unofficial, technically, but real. He called Ethan the day it was finalized and said simply, "It's done," in a voice that carried 22 months of accumulated weight finally being set down. "Yes," Ethan said. "You gonna be all right?" "I think so." "That's higher confidence than I expected from you." "Don't read too much into it," Marcus laughed, a short, genuine sound that Ethan wasn't sure he'd ever heard from him before. "Get some sleep, Walker." He did, eventually. It took a few more weeks. The federal contract review concluded formally on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, with a finding that Caldwell Technologies had not been complicit in or negligent toward the security breach, that the breach had been introduced through a compromised senior employee acting outside the company's knowledge, and that the company's cooperation with the investigation had been comprehensive and material to its success. The contract process resumed. Ethan heard about it from Victoria the day the finding came through, in a phone call that was noticeably different from every previous call between them, less tightly wound, less carrying the particular pressure of someone managing multiple serious things simultaneously. "The board met this morning," she said. "The formal statement goes out at 3. How did the meeting go?" "Difficult, uncomfortable, necessary." A pause. "Two of the board members wanted to know how I hadn't detected Briggs's compromise earlier. I told them that sophisticated long-term infiltration is designed specifically to evade internal detection, and that the correct lesson is not that I failed to see it, but that the detection came from an outside perspective that I had the judgment to trust when it arrived." "That's a good answer." "It's also true, which helps." He heard something in her voice, a lightness that sat alongside the seriousness rather than displacing it. "They accepted it, conditionally. I have 6 months to implement a new external security review structure, which I was planning to do anyway. Will you use Marcus's contacts for that?" "I already talked to him about it. He said he'd help me build the right framework." A short pause. "He also said you recommended him for the work." "He's the best person I know for it." "He said the same thing about you." Ethan was sitting on the bench on his building's front steps. He'd come down for air after an afternoon of reading through the last of the formal interview documentation, and the street in front of him was doing its late afternoon business. A woman walking a large, self-important dog. 2 kids on bikes arguing about something without slowing down. The bodega on the corner with its hand-lettered sign about the soup special. "Victoria?" he said. "Yes." "I'd like to take Mia and Lily somewhere this weekend. Somewhere ordinary. A park, or the aquarium. Mia has been asking about the aquarium for 2 months, and I keep finding reasons to delay it." He stopped. "I'm not sure what I'm asking exactly. I'm not good at this part." A pause on her end, and he couldn't read its shape from this distance. "The aquarium is a good idea," she said. "Lily has been asking about the jellyfish exhibit specifically. Apparently there are jellyfish that glow." "There are," he said. "Bioluminescent. They light up in the dark." "Then we should probably see them." He exhaled slowly. "Saturday." "Saturday?" she said. "Oh." The aquarium was loud and slightly overwhelming in the way that places designed for children always were, which meant Mia was delighted, and Ethan spent the first 20 minutes recalibrating to an environment where every surface reflected blue light and small humans ran in directions that didn't correspond to any logical crowd flow. Lily arrived holding Victoria's hand and wearing a coat that had a small whale embroidered on the pocket, which she pointed out to Mia within approximately 4 seconds of their meeting. Mia examined the whale with appropriate seriousness. "I have a horse on my backpack." "Horses are good," Lily said. "So are whales." And that, apparently, was sufficient. They walked ahead into the aquarium together, like children who had known each other longer than 5 minutes, which they had not, but which children could pull off in a way that adults had mostly lost the capacity for. Ethan and Victoria fell into step behind them at the distance that kept both girls visible. "That was easier than I expected," Victoria said. "Children don't overcomplicate the initial assessment," Ethan said. "They just decide." "Maybe we should all do that." "Maybe." They moved through the aquarium the way you move through a place that exists specifically to slow people down. From the tide pool exhibit, where Mia tried to touch everything and was gently redirected by a volunteer who had clearly done this 10,000 times, to the shark tank, where both girls pressed their noses against the glass with identical expressions of concentrated awe, to the deep sea section, where the lighting shifted to near dark and the tanks glowed. The jellyfish exhibit was at the back of the deep sea section, in a circular room where the only illumination came from the tanks themselves. The jellyfish moved through their water in the slow, purposeless-looking way that was actually entirely purposeful, pulsing, trailing, lit from within in pale blues and greens, and a color that was somewhere between lavender and white that didn't have a common name. Lily stood in front of the largest tank with both hands pressed flat against the glass, and her face tipped up, completely still. Mia stood beside her, equally still, which was notable because Mia was not a still child. Victoria stopped beside Ethan, and they both watched the girls watch the jellyfish. "She's been like this since Daniel died," Victoria said quietly. "Not for the room, just for him. Looking for things that are beautiful and just, standing in front of them, not needing to explain or describe, just being present to them." A pause. "I used to worry it was grief doing something strange to her. Now I think it's just who she is." "She knew the right thing to do in a frightening situation," Ethan said. "She was scared and she stayed in one place and she paid attention. That's not something you teach a 7-year-old. It's in her." Victoria looked at Lily for a long moment. Daniel was like that, in the good version of himself before everything else. He had this quality of paying attention to things. He could sit with something beautiful for a long time without needing to do anything with it. She paused. "I rushed past things more. I was always moving to the next." "You've had to be." "I know, that's true. But I'm also—" She stopped, considering. "I'm trying to learn to stand still more, in front of things worth standing still for." The jellyfish pulsed and drifted. Lily turned her head slightly and looked at Ethan. "Do they know they're glowing?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's just what they are. They don't think about it." She turned back to the tank. "That's better," she said, with the decisive certainty of a child who has resolved something. Mia looked up at Ethan with her expression of analytical engagement. "What are they thinking about instead?" "I don't think they think the way we do. They just move and glow. That's the whole thing." "That sounds good," Mia said. He looked at his daughter in the blue light and felt, with a specificity that surprised him, something close to gratitude. Not the performed kind, not the kind you express when something is going well and you want to mark it appropriately, but the deeper and more uncomfortable kind that arrives when you're genuinely aware of how much you have and how easily it could be otherwise. He had not always deserved what he had. He'd made choices that were selfish, dressed up as protective. He'd kept people at a distance and called it caution. He'd confused the discipline of not needing anything with actual strength, and the distinction between those two things had cost him years he couldn't get back. He was 37 years old. He was not young, but he was not old either, and the years ahead were not fixed in their shape. That was the one thing that sustained him when the weight of the accumulated past got heavy enough to be immobilizing, that the future had not yet been written in a way that made the past definitive. You could be a different person than you had been. Not radically, not completely. The person you were left marks, and pretending otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. But incrementally, in the daily specific choices about whether to show up or hold back, whether to speak or stay quiet for the wrong reasons, whether to let someone matter to you or maintain the careful distance that felt like wisdom and was actually just fear. In those choices, accumulated over time, a person could become someone worth being. He was working on it. He would keep working on it. Victoria was standing close enough that their shoulders were almost touching in the narrow space of the exhibit room, and she hadn't moved away. And he hadn't moved away. And neither of them had said anything about this because some things accumulated their own meaning without requiring words to establish them. After the aquarium, they walked to a noodle place 2 blocks away that had 8 tables and a handwritten menu and a cook who worked behind a low counter where you could watch the whole operation, which both girls found transfixing. They ate at a table by the window with the city moving past on the other side of the glass, and Lily told a story about a caterpillar she had found in Rachel's garden that took approximately 14 narrative detours before arriving at its conclusion, which was that the caterpillar had been relocated to a safer location near the back fence. Mia listened to the whole story with genuine attention and then asked three specific questions about the caterpillar's eventual fate, all of which Lily answered with complete seriousness. Ethan watched them across the table. Victoria watched him watch them. "You're doing the quiet thing," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "I know." He looked at her. Not the bad kind this time. She held his gaze, and something in her face, the last remaining layer of management and careful control, let go entirely, just for a moment, and what was underneath it was simply a person who had been through a great deal and was, at this particular table in this particular noodle restaurant, not in the middle of any of it. "Good," she said, and turned back to the girls. 3 months later, Ethan sat in a conference room at Sandra Okafor's office for what she said would be the final formal debrief, the capstone interview that would close the official record on the linchpin exposure. The room was government standard and slightly too cold and had a water dispenser that made a periodic sound like clearing its throat. Sandra had the final documentation in front of her and a recorder running on the table between them. "For the record," she said, "can you describe your original involvement with the linchpin monitoring and the circumstances of the overruling?" He described it. He had described it 3 times now in formal context, and the description had become, through repetition, a thing he could give without the emotional charge it used to carry. Not because the charge wasn't real, but because it had been processed into something he could set down and pick up again when needed, rather than something he carried continuously. When he finished, Sandra said, "And in your assessment, was the overruling the result of deliberate compromise or institutional failure?" He had thought about this for years in various configurations and had arrived at an answer he was comfortable with. Both. Institutional failure creates the conditions in which deliberate compromise can operate invisibly. The two aren't distinct. One enables the other. Sandra wrote something. Final question. In your view, what should have been done differently at the institutional level to prevent the outcome? Listen to people who were closer to the information even when their conclusions were inconvenient. He paused. The people who are actually inside something usually know when it's wrong. The failure is almost always in the structures that are supposed to incorporate that knowledge and don't. Sandra looked at him steadily. That applies to a lot of things beyond intelligence networks. Yes, he said, it does. She closed the folder. That's the record complete. She extended her hand and he shook it. For what it's worth, Walker, and I've said this once privately, so I'll say it once on record, you were right a decade ago. The designation was wrong. The outcome of that error is documented in this file, and I intend to ensure it's part of the institutional conversation going forward. He nodded. He didn't have a response that improved on that, so he didn't reach for one. He drove home. Well, it was spring by then, the kind of spring that arrives after a winter that went on too long, where the warmth feels earned rather than expected, where people walk differently because something in the air has shifted, and the body knows it before the mind articulates it. Ethan picked up Mia from school on a Thursday afternoon, and she came out the gate with her backpack bouncing and a piece of paper held aloft like a trophy. I got 100 on the math test, she announced. I thought you weren't good at math. I lied, she said, completely unapologetically. He took the test, looked at it, handed it back. Why did you tell me you weren't good at it? She shrugged. I didn't want you to expect it all the time. He looked at his daughter, this specific, particular, deeply individual person who had opinions about ice cream loyalty and caterpillar welfare and the strategic management of parental expectations. Noted, he said. I'll recalibrate. Don't make it a whole thing. I won't. They walked to the car. She talked about something that had happened at lunch. He listened. The afternoon was warm enough for just a jacket, and the trees along the street were doing what trees did in spring. That brief, excessive blooming that always looked slightly embarrassing, like the trees had decided to overcommit. He didn't know what his life would look like in a year. He had a reasonable picture of the next few months. There was ongoing work with Sandra's office, which he'd agreed to on a consulting basis, limited and specific, the kind that didn't require him to rebuild the operational life he'd left behind, but allowed what he knew to be useful. There was the security framework he was helping Marcus build for Caldwell Technologies, which was detailed work that suited the part of his brain that liked things to be thorough. There was Mia, who was going to second grade in the fall, and had already expressed opinions about her future teacher based on intelligence gathered from older students, which was both impressive and slightly concerning. And there was Victoria. They had dinner together most weeks, sometimes with the girls and sometimes without, and it had the quality of something that was finding its own pace. Not rushed, not performing a version of itself for anyone's benefit, just two people who had been through an unusual experience together and had decided without a great deal of ceremony that they wanted to keep showing up for each other. It was not a simple thing. She ran a company, and he had a past, and they both had daughters, and they both had grief they were still working through in their respective ways. Nothing about it was simple, but simplicity had never been what either of them was actually looking for. There was an evening, in the middle of all of it, that Ethan thought about sometimes when he was trying to locate why things felt different than they had before. It was an ordinary evening, dinner at Victoria's house, the girls in the living room with a movie, the sound of it drifting through to the kitchen where he and Victoria were cleaning up after a meal that had been slightly overcooked, but nobody had complained about. He was washing a pot, and she was at the counter cutting up fruit for later, and neither of them was saying anything, and the silence was, he struggled to describe it, even internally, not empty, not pointed, just present. He had been so afraid for so long of what presence required. The openness, the ongoing willingness to be known by another person, the continuous small risk of showing someone what you actually were rather than the edited version. He had told himself this was wisdom, that he'd seen enough of the world to know that presence came with cost. And it did come with cost. That part was true. What he'd been wrong about was the other side of the ledger. He'd calculated the cost carefully and never bothered to add up what absence cost. What it cost Mia to have a father who was physically present and emotionally managed. What it cost him to live inside a life he'd built for safety rather than for actual living. You could not protect yourself into a full life. At some point, protection became its own kind of poverty. He had been a man of considerable discipline for many years, and the discipline had served him and had also hollowed out parts of him that needed something other than discipline to function. He was trying now to let those parts be useful again, trying to be someone who was not only organized around what he could survive, but around what he could, with patience and imperfection and genuine effort, build. Victoria looked up from the cutting board and said, "You're doing the quiet thing again." "Yes." "Good or bad?" "Good," he said. "Definitely the good kind." She smiled, a real one, without management, without performance. The kind of smile that arrived because something was actually worth smiling at. She turned back to the cutting board. He finished the pot. Outside the kitchen window, the city went on with its ordinary and extraordinary business, indifferent, as always, to the specific lives being lived inside its particular latitude and longitude. It did not stop or slow for the fact that a man who had spent many years being invisible had decided, finally, that he no longer wanted to be. That was never how it worked. The city moved, and the people inside it did the small, crucial, impermanent work of constructing meaning from what they had, and whether that work succeeded or failed was not a matter of circumstance or luck, so much as a matter of whether you kept showing up to do it. Ethan Walker kept showing up. That was, in the end, the thing he was most capable of. And for the first time in a very long time, it was enough, more than enough, to build something real from.